By my life or death, I can protect you. I will. You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And mine.
The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers came out in October of 2002 for the PlayStation 2, then the Xbox and GameCube 2 months later. It also came out for the Game Boy Advance, but that's something else entirely that we'll kind of just ignore. The history of Lord of the Rings video games is a strange one. Long before the movies came out, a couple of different developers had a crack at making something based off of J.R.R. Tolkien's books. Beam Software made a few text-adventure games in the 80s, in addition to a strategy game a few years later. Melbourne House made an RTS called War in Middle-earth, and Interplay made a couple of RPGs on PC, which was later released on the Super NES, but was really different, I think. That last one was in 1994. That's the last we saw of Lord of the Rings for quite some time. It wasn't until around 2000, where the film trilogy was announced, that the licensing was in high demand again. This is where things get kind of weird. Electronic Arts, better known as EA, acquired the rights to the film trilogy, whereas Vivendi Games acquired the rights to make video games about any of Tolkien's books. Both companies started work on getting games under that license out immediately to capitalize on the film franchise's success. The Fellowship of the Ring, developed by the Whole Experience Games, published by Black Label Games, which was a publishing label of Vivendi Games, was released in September of 2002 for the original Xbox, then was later ported to the PS2, PC, and Game Boy Advance. The Two Towers, developed by Stormfront Studios, was published by EA Games, came out in October, 1 month after. If you were a kid and wondered why the two games that seemingly were named for their film counterparts felt so different, this is the answer. The Fellowship of the Ring was based entirely off the books and couldn't reference or use source material from the movie. It also tried to go with a more lighthearted tone, which, if your only exposure to Tolkien's work was the recent film, probably would have left your little edgy brain underwhelmed. Apparently the gameplay wasn't all that great either, but I've never played it extensively, so I don't really know. In EA's The Two Towers, not only could you play through the battles of the second film 2 months before the movie hit the theaters, you could relive the events of the first movie as well, making Vivendi's attempt even less appealing. There was now nothing holding anyone back from jumping right into what looked like the second game of a series. Because EA had the rights to it, the entire game was based directly on the trilogy. The settings and landmarks were nearly identical, the visual design was just as grounded and dark as the films, the enemy and character models were made to look like their movie counterparts, and the actors provided extra voiceover lines for the game. They even included some behind-the-scenes extras in the way of interviews with the actors about the game's development and how it felt to be in a video game. Now, if you were a kid, having just watched The Fellowship of the Ring and getting prepared to go see the new movie, which would you prefer to play? I can promise you none of that was on my mind when I was a kid playing this the first time, as I didn't even know about the attempt from Vivendi Games. This was the Lord of the Rings video game, and it was incredible. Now, is it still great to play, or was it a product of its time? Well, both. Let's start with the visuals. It's nearly a 20-year-old game, but genuinely, I say this with no sarcasm, it looks pretty amazing for the most part. Elijah Wood thinks so too.
It's just beautiful to look at.
They nailed the likeness of the characters from the films, the environments look one-to-one to what you saw in the movie, and the transitions... No, not yet. I'll get to that later. The biggest gripe I have is how dark the game is. If you're looking to play this again, make sure your TV has its brightness settings up, and maybe turn all the lights off too. I've never had this issue with older games before in my TV, but I literally couldn't see anything in the opening level before I changed the brightness settings. It doesn't help that the majority of levels are set at night, sometimes indoors. The path to the Mines of Moria, Moria itself, everything in Helm's Deep, but even in Fangorn Forest, it gets just as bad. I guess it makes sense for it to be that way, as it's of course Fangorn Forest, but just look at this scene where the troll ambushes you. Maybe this worked in the game's favor, as of course older models and texture work show their flaws when brightly lit for all to see. Maybe, but I still think the bright outdoor areas looked fine. There's a few nice tricks they played with the water effects. You'll see plenty of splashes and waves. You can see your reflection as you wade through waist-high water, in addition to the enemies when they show up. And of course you have the nice Easter egg of seeing the Ent in the water when crossing a creek in Fangorn Forest. Maybe I'm giving games of this era too little credit, but I was surprised at how good this all looked. And the one specific effect I remembered being incredible as a kid still looked incredible to me as an adult. The game uses plenty of footage from the actual movies. It's nice to see, as of course the Lord of the Rings films are great, so I'll never be upset when a live-action cutscene shows up. To seemingly show how good the graphics were, or to blur the divide between the movie and what you get to experience in-game, they transition from movie to game in real time, right in the middle of a scene. I thought for sure these would have aged poorly and been hard to look at, but it ended up being one of the parts I was impressed with most. I can't see this opening shot of the elves without expecting it to cut to the video game version. Nothing before the Two Towers ever managed to so firmly place me into one of my favorite movies. The sound design is overall pretty great as well. The music in the background of the menus and the missions are straight from the film score. That soundtrack is iconic, so it would feel weird if it wasn't included. These days it's hard to picture anything Lord of the Rings without a few of these songs. When you're playing through the missions, the music isn't static the whole way through either. It reacts to what's going on. When you get ambushed in Fangorn Forest, for example, it goes from extremely quiet to a sudden flourish. The voiceovers are a mixed bag. Watching the special features, Orlando Bloom talks about how different it is to do regular ADR for a film compared to voiceover in a video game. ADR sound recordings offer some visual guidance, as on screen they can see how they said the lines the first time and match them with improved audio quality. For voiceovers in a video game, you don't get any visuals to go off of, so of course it would be a little more difficult for it to sound as authentic. I think Frodo's lines sounded the most natural, which makes sense as Elijah Wood would go on to do plenty of voice acting in the future. It's also great seeing how passionately he expressed his love for being in the game, even though he wasn't even playable.
Frodo looks like me. Isn't that cool? So cool.
So although a few of the lines feel stiff, the fact that the game included voice work from the actors at all, instead of text boxes or discount impressionists, is a win in my mind. It could have been a lot worse. Besides the music and voice acting, the gameplay sounds good for the most part. Everything sounds like you'd expect it would, except for one thing. This is the sound effect that plays anytime you're hit with an enemy's weapon. What does it sound like to you? To me it sounds like a whip, and not the licorice kind.
Crack that whip. Licorice whip. I said whip it. Licorice whip.
Besides the whip noises, the overall soundscape when playing is great. When you break shields or finish combo attacks, it sounds satisfyingly powerful. The music and voice acting, in addition to level-specific sounds like the Horn of Gondor, or enemies calling to reload a trebuchet, blur the lines between video game and film even more.
Steel yourself!
The gameplay at its core is a hack-and-slash action game. You won't be juggling or anything close to it, but you do get a few combos to play with, in addition to ranged attacks with all three heroes. You have your weak attack, which is fast and can function as a block if an enemy attacks you while you swing, your strong attack, which can break shields and knock enemies down, you can stab downwards to finish enemies off, a wimpy kick that comes in handy later on, and a parry maneuver. As you progress through the game, you'll level up the characters to unlock certain skills and upgrades. Most of them are new combos that chain together to finish off with a powerful flourish attack. Some grant a new ability, like being able to attack while getting up from the ground, upgrading your maximum health, upgrading your ranged attack power and color, and even a charge-up attack. You also have your Goblin, Orc, and Uruk-hai counters. Parry their attack, press the right button combination, and you have yourself an instant kill. If you want to break the game, literally, this is the skill for you. Not only is it by far the easiest way to take down harder enemies in one hit, circumvent the necessity of wasting time destroying shields, but it also completely freezes the action while the animation plays. All of the enemies freeze in place to wait for you to finish. It's kind of funny.
The orcs are upon the wall!
The shielded enemies without the counterattack are some of the biggest hassles you'll deal with. Specifically, if you're Legolas, your strong attacks will seemingly never land in the right hitboxes for their shield to break. Usually it takes 1 or 2 hits, but with Legolas it took many tries, which ended up making a few missions extremely difficult to get through. Besides that, there are primarily two annoying things about the gameplay. The first is how easy it is for enemies to knock you over. Getting knocked down in video games is never a good feeling, especially when your goal is to protect something in the mission. The enemies can get stuck in a loop where they knock you down over and over if you don't have the rising attack skill, which means more and more licorice whips. The other problem I had was the input buffering. This is a pretty frantic and fast-paced game, especially in the later levels, so it happened fairly often where I would get locked into an attack animation simply because the game remembered I had pressed the button a second or two ago. The times this happened the most frequently was when the rising attack happened. As I was getting up, I probably spammed the attack so the skill would trigger, but instead of letting me override the previous input with a downward stab to finish the enemy off, it would make Aragorn do a weak attack, thus ruining the easy kill. Out of the three main characters you can play, they all have their own feel to them. Even though I couldn't for the life of me break enemy shields as Legolas, firing his fully upgraded bow into the masses with an increased arrow count was extremely fun. Aragorn's quiver only holds half of what Legolas's can, but his strong attacks get the job done, and his charge attack feels great. Gimli gets the least ammo count of them all, and his throwing axes are much tougher to use in a bind, but, at least... Actually, Gimli is the worst out of all of them. I think it mostly comes down to his ranged attacks, his speed, and his attack animations. He's fairly slow to move around with, his axe feels short and stubby, and his throwing axes work differently than the other characters' bows. You'd think it would all handle the same, but with shooting arrows I can spam the attack button and have no issues. The same isn't true with the axes. You seemingly have to time out your button presses very deliberately. There are quite a lot of areas where you need to use your ranged weapon too, such as the troll fight in Balin's Tomb, taking down faraway enemies in normal missions, and throwing them at explosive enemies or barrels at a moment's notice. It just feels sluggish and unresponsive. Speaking of that troll though, the way these guys were designed has me wondering if there was an oversight in development or maybe playtesting. If you take them on normally, they offer quite the challenge. Most of them can't be hit with arrows or throwing axes, and you can't parry their attacks either. I was stuck on this one in Fangorn Forest for a long time, enough to restart the mission 4 or 5 times, until I discovered the cheesiest strategy. Chain the first half of your strong attack combo on them, and they are defenseless. Once I learned that, I never had problems with these guys again. I wish I could say the same thing about the Warg Riders in this mission, however. Actually, not all of them, just this one boss Warg Rider. You can't touch him at all, even though he's identical looking to the other ones you could kill within a few hits. Instead, you need to wait for his work to go on its hind legs, shoot it with an arrow, get one combo chain in, and run away. When he charges at you, it's extremely hard to dodge. Oh yeah, there's a dodge button. I forgot to mention it. Oh right, that's why I didn't mention it. It doesn't work. It's alright though, cheese the game once more by retreating to this pond, and watch him never be able to hit you again. You gotta love the early 2000s games. For the most part, all of the missions have a similar goal: get from one end of it to the other alive. There are a few exceptions, which we'll get to. I think the decision to make a level select screen with definite start and end points to each mission was a smart one, and probably a necessary one given how tight of a deadline they had. Up to this point, there were barely any video games at all with Middle-earth as the location, so asking for anything more than a linear level-to-level adventure is just greedy and would have been short-sighted. Lord of the Rings didn't need a big risky outing to see what could be possible. A short and solid action game, letting you play around in these film scenes come to life, was a perfect selling point that this medium would work well with this license. I also think it helps the replayability factor. Going back into specific missions to play with different characters stretched the game's length out considerably, and because it wasn't necessary to see the final story mission, it never felt like padding. Probably the most interesting part of the whole experience is Isildur. The first mission is the tutorial, which features a unique character at the start of the prologue for the Fellowship of the Ring. This is such a smart way to go about it, it still kind of bewilders me when I think about it even now. I guarantee there were kids who played this video game before watching the movies. I'm not claiming they would fully understand what's going on, but introducing everybody, people familiar with the lore and newcomers alike, with the introductory prologue leading into the tutorial where you get to take part in that prologue from the film is genius. Even now, having watched the movies half a dozen times at least, getting to play as Isildur thousands of years before the events of the main story is so cool. Him having the same moveset as Aragorn makes perfect sense as well. The other missions follow the films for the most part, with a few exceptions. The first real mission you play as Aragorn, fighting against the Nazguls at Weathertop where you need to use the fire to ward them off. Your torch losing its flame, requiring you to swing it near the lit fire, is a nice touch. On the path to Moria, you encounter goblins, and something odd happens. Depending on which character you picked for your adventure, the other two in the trio will sometimes be there, sometimes they won't. It changes how the cutscenes work as well. No matter what in this mission, Gimli has to go with, and no matter what, even if you choose Gimli, he rushes in and Aragorn or Legolas saves him by shooting a goblin. The mission ends with the Watcher in the water. Instead of it grabbing Frodo, you fight it one-on-one. You have to parry his tentacles, then attack it from long range. I remember as a kid dying repeatedly at this section. It's really rather simple, the kid in me just hated defense. Balin's Tomb is just like the film, and ends with you fighting the troll seemingly one-on-one, avoiding his chain whip attacks, and either shooting arrows or axes at him to finish him off. The Battle of Amon Hen is one of my favorite missions, if only because it's so brightly lit, and there are lots of unshielded Uruk-hai to fight. There's a timer for how long Frodo has until he's captured, you have an Uruk-hai count for how many are left in the mission, and once Frodo escapes, the timer changes to Boromir's Doom Clock instead. Once you get to him, the fight ensues with Lurtz. This part is also kind of funny. Obviously this was meant to be Aragorn's fight, but you can do it with Legolas and Gimli and it plays out just the same. The first mission that takes place in the Two Towers is in Fangorn Forest. This is really the only one where it makes heavy changes. The three split up, you encounter many orcs and goblins, and a total of 4 trolls. The Rohan trilogy is up next. Saving this town is another nice one since it's so bright. Lots of Uruk-hai, lots of licorice whip sound effects. And Gandalf. This is really weird. Gandalf is in this level, and he has attack animations, spells, and the signature Staff Slam. He even changes the way he opens up this door depending on how far away he is. I wonder if Gandalf was initially going to be a playable character and was scrapped since they couldn't make it work for the entire game, or if this was just a teaser for things to come next year. In one of the strangest excuses for your allies to abandon you, Gandalf says he is needed elsewhere, he vanishes, you keep playing, then he appears a few minutes later in the same town like he never left. Hey buddy. It's cool that in this mission you do get to save civilians, they even have their own health bar. After this we have the explosives level. This one also has a slightly different cutscene depending on who you're playing. Aragorn and Legolas of course shoot the explosives, but Gimli has to throw his axe. Aw, poor guy. It just looks out of place. After this we have the worst level in the game. It's basically just a boss fight. It's the warg boss I mentioned earlier. Oh no, my friends can't help me. There's no way around this burned down house. Some friends they are. This won't be the last time our friends abandon us either. Finally, after this, we prepare for the Helm's Deep 3-part finale. Starting off on the wall of Helm's Deep, we get voice lines that sound familiar, but are somewhat different.
I got 2. There are enough for us both, Gimli.
And thus, the never-ending level begins. Seriously, this level takes a long time, is pretty difficult, and if you fail, you restart the whole thing. The main goal is to survive while keeping the wall clear from enemies. Once too many get up, the meter at the top turns red, and you fail the mission if something isn't done about it. The meter is a really intuitive way to signify the ladder placements as well. Kicking down ladders is essential for success, and it's never a wonder of which location on the wall has ladders up or not. I can't imagine how awful this level would feel without it. The mission ramps up its stakes as time goes on. Initially it's only goblins on the wall, which of course makes no sense as in the film this fight is against Saruman's army, which consisted of Uruk-hai, but it's obviously not a big deal. After that it goes to orcs, then the Uruk-hai, then finally the bald sword-flailing Uruk-hai. Different events happen as well. At one point flaming arrows get shot towards the ladders, which damage you if you're too close, and catapults get launched in near the end, which actually ends up helping you clear out the wall since it hits enemies as well. Once you've survived long enough, the elves come to save the day. Gimli and Legolas compare kill counts.
I got 19. Then we are level.
19, huh? My kill screen says something different. And then we see a fantastic in-game cutscene showing the bomber that blows up the wall. I know it's like a 5-second scene, I just really like how good it looks. Helm's Deep 2, Electric Slide, is you fending off waves of enemies as they try to break down this door. Here is where your friends show their true colors. Where are they? They left you here to defend this door all by yourself. I think this level has the highest kill count by far as well. Oh man, it just keeps going. 164. 164 goblins, orcs, and urukai. Yeah, no big deal guys, I got this. After you take down a catapult by yourself at the end, your friends come out to steal the spotlight like they were helping all along. This is basically how most group projects go in school. Finally, we have our final mission, defend this bigger door. The amount of enemies on screen in this mission is pretty insane. It feels like a huge battle is taking place. At some point, one of your pals will need help. If you play as Aragorn or Gimli, this part makes sense. Look at Legolas shooting all those enemies in a row, what a guy. But if you play as Legolas, it's instead Aragorn doing archery kills. It doesn't really seem true to Aragorn as a character, but alright. Afterwards, Gimli needs your help, you go back, help him out, archers are on the walls, take them out, go back, and now the toughest enemies come out to play. Bald Urukai once more, and for the finale, 2 trolls for good measure. Take them down fair and square, or cheese them with the strong attack, your choice. Afterwards, the door breaks open anyway, but of course we get the iconic look to the east scene, dramatically shortened, thankfully, can't spoil everything for early players. Afterwards, we get a teaser for Return of the King. After this, if you achieve level 10 with any of the characters, you can do the secret mission with them. It's basically a gauntlet mode, 20 waves of enemies, your health regenerates a little bit after each successful wave, and you of course get a cool arena to battle in from Saruman. It's pretty fun, and it's pretty tough. If you finish it with any of the trio, you unlock Isildur as a playable character. I love this addition so much. His moveset is identical to Aragorn's, and he's already level 10, so it's nearly superfluous, but I love it anyway. You also unlock the secret gauntlet mission to play with Isildur. Once you finish that, you get to see the end credits. You also unlock a bunch of cheat codes. This is such a product of this era in video games. This sort of thing is just something you don't see anymore. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just fun to look back on. The only criticism I have of earning the end credits and cheat codes through beating the secret mission with Isildur is you really have to be used to playing as Aragorn. If you exclusively played as Gimli or Legolas, I doubt you'd feel comfortable playing the secret final mission. It almost seems like Gimli and Legolas were added later on in production. Most of the cutscenes fit much better with Aragorn as the main character. You start with his moveset in the first 2 levels, and the framing device of the game is Aragorn telling the Fellowship's journey to get to Helm's Deep, not to mention the bizarre Lurtz fight if you chose Legolas or Gimli. Regardless if it made things a little weird, having more characters is definitely a positive. Like I said, going through all the missions with different playstyles felt like a worthwhile use of my time. All that being said, is Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers still a good video game? Yeah, absolutely. There are some minor complaints with the gameplay, but the overall quality holds up surprisingly well. I think a lot of that has to go to how closely it sticks to the film, and the decision to make this a hack-and-slash action game. The source material is phenomenal already, so there was no need to attempt something risky, especially this being one of the first Tolkien games in a decade. The very nature of action games is they're very gameplay intensive, meaning how good it felt to play moment to moment was probably a big focus in development. It isn't incredibly deep, but these types of games really don't need to be. It's complex enough to not get boring immediately, there's enough enemy variety and combos to keep the combat more engaging than just spamming the attack button, and the slight differences in how the characters play add that layer of replayability. Even though these days games set in Middle-earth seem to be living in licensing hell, I hope one day that we might see a port of this to current devices. It's just a shame this solid title will forever be shackled to older hardware. I still think, even 20 years later, it was well worth going back to.
Ox.